Good afternoon and welcome to our live Liberty Alert. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz and the Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to step back a little bit from kind of the news-driven way we're dealing with some of these issues to an issue that is kind of always in the news and always behind the news, which is the sanctity of life. We support basically four major things as we engage the public realm in government in D.C. Religious liberty, and we've been talking about that a lot, and we're going to continue to because that's a huge issue for this election. The sanctity of life. Those two are big issues because they really affect every human person in our country, even in the world in which we live. And then, of course, the institution of marriage and educational freedom as religious liberty issues that are also vital to our culture. So today we're going to talk about that, probably the most positive, the clearest cultural voice we have today, the sanctity of life. Why is it so controversial though? What does it support? What does it challenge? What is it offering? And what are the threats to that pro-life view of life that's out there today? And why should it matter? This is an issue, it should matter to everyone. In fact, I just read an article, I'm not going to talk about it today, but an article where there are 20 million pro-life Democrats who are saying enough is enough, and they're trying to get it back on the Democratic platform. For those of you who are Democrats and Christians in my audience, I'm just telling you, the Democratic Party is really not open whatsoever to the pro-life message within their own party, and they're driving people who have that message out of their party. The question is, how big of an issue is this? Well, to me, it's huge. It's the fundamental issue of our culture. If pro-life gives way, then none of this other stuff matters. So again, I applaud those who are Democrats who are trying to get it back on the platform. But again, my biggest issue right now is we've got it on the Republican platform. Now let's get the politicians to actually honor what they say they're going to do. That's the next level of this thing too. But again, we're going to talk about that today. To all of us who are Christian, this should be the fundamental issue that undergirds everything we do in the public realm. And we'll talk about why that is in just a minute. It doesn't make us narrow voters. It actually makes us voters who see the fundamental issues in almost everything that's going on in our public life. And that's a good thing, actually. Again, those of you who are tuning in, I know a lot of you are actually using our recordings rather than being with us on live, but that's great too. Keep sharing this. Please join our Monday Devotion Friday op-ed that comes out it's emailed out every week by going to lcrlfreedom.org, and you can sign up for the Word from the Center email offerings there. But keep sharing our webpage with people, keep sharing with folks what we're doing in DC, because we are there to advocate, to educate, and to encourage for the sake of these issues so that the church can be about its ministry in the public without fear. All right, so today it's election time, and I think this is what's interesting about Two Kingdom people. We tend to think of election time as a time we get involved in politics, and when it's over, then we get back to living. We need to start to realize that the people we're battling against in politics, they never take any time off. They don't see life as, a public realm, and they don't see it as two kingdoms where the government stuff is penultimate and it's limited, and so it's like the basement floor where the proclamation of life and liberty and pursuit of happiness and all that, especially from God's point of view, that's what life's about. They see it all as one, and to them politics is church and taxes are their offering, and we're up against folks who do this 24/7, 365 days a year. But at least at this time of the year, we start to get serious about our voice in the public realm, and we need to take it seriously and understand that we are contending with other voices in the public realm for the sake of our culture. So, the clearest moral voice I think we do have in culture as a church is the pro-life voice. It's fundamental, it's foundational in Scripture, but it's fundamental to life itself. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, okay? There is, I guess the question we have to grapple with this. Why is this so controversial? And I actually gave you a mom and pop paper, and this will be posted on our website. I try to bring up some of these older mom and pop papers when they become valuable teaching tools, and I'll post them for you as we use them again. But one of them is called No Higher Authority, and I keep going back to this. The reason why the pro-life message and even the pro-marriage message and all these things are so controversial is because there is a no. The word no is in the message. So God has a no and God has a yes. There's a moral no and a moral yes. Well, our culture basically says there are no no's anymore in anything we do. The libertinism of the 60s kind of brought that secularism of the last 150 years to full fruition in our lives, and it came down to, I am the authority in my life, and there is no in my life other than that which I think I should lay on myself for whatever reason. But if I feel like doing it, I should do it. And if I feel like it's okay for me, it's okay for me. And you can't tell me otherwise. Well, the Bible obviously says no. God created you and you're a moral being, and they're the 10 Commandments. But gosh, we've got plenty of data in history. We've got plenty of data in sociology and in psychology and in law and order. We've got all kinds of data that said people who don't abide by any kind of self-discipline wind up destroying their own culture, their own house, their own neighborhood, their own families. There are no's in life, and they're inherent in what it means to be a human person. So I think the simplest say is, why is this controversial? Because there's a no involved in this discussion, and that no falls on all of us. But there are people who are saying, no, we're going to throw off all of those kinds of things. Now, before we get into the pro-life stuff, let me just go through the week in review a little bit. The pandemic chaos, I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, I've read through all of this stuff, and it comes down to, we can't have fear to start living our lives because we have a virus in our midst. I'm a little bit disturbed that this virus was set upon the world. I'm more troubled by that and why we're not investigating any of that. But the fact is, we should go about our business. We should practice hygiene. We should social distance. I'll wear the masks, but again, it just amazes me how the science has shifted on the masks in a matter of 3 months. It was scientifically verboten to wear masks 3 months ago. You were ridiculed for wearing masks in public by science. Now it's scientifically absolute, and of course the politicians now are using that to control their clientele again. But again, when I talk about this, social distance, hygiene, and go about your business and care for, and we have enough science on this. We know the vulnerable population to this virus. And by the way, the virus over time, there's going to be, as people go out and start to live again, people are going to get infected. It's a virus. You can't stop it. You can't stop the flu, but you can mitigate it. And so we now know that most people who really get affected by this are people with pre-existing conditions and older folks. And so I think the average age is somewhere in the high 70s or even 80 for those who die from this. And that's troubling. So we want to isolate our grandparents and those who are older or elderly and make sure that we protect the most vulnerable population. But again, when it comes down to the science and the schools and all this kind of stuff, you can see how this is being used, is being manipulated politically. People right now, that the younger generation could get the virus, but it's not going to really affect them all that much. That's part of the process of the virus becoming weaker over time and eventually being dealt with. So again, the science has been radically different on multiple different occasions, and we're going to have to learn how to live amidst this as we go forward. And I think that's the best way forward. And we're going to still have to protect our liberties, because it's amazing the exemptions. When you read these orders, well, these groups are exempted and this group's exempted. Where did you come up with the exemptions? If we're in a pandemic that is it's such a monstrosity, why are not all people subject to this? So again, those are the kind of issues we'll keep you aware of. But go about your business, live lives that honor, that honor some of these healthy responses, but let's not let it shut us down, because we can't shut down in the midst of this. The science has already shown that that was kind of a ridiculous move. One thing that is starting to bother me, besides the fact that so-called science is all over the map, because even in some things like this, the virus is mutating, and so when they get a handle on this, they might not get a handle on that. When you start to look at all those things, the absolutists are the ones that are really problematic, and the political absolutists are the ones that are very problematic. What's becoming a real problem to me is that some voices are being scrubbed from this discussion. I had a friend of mine who, Cedric Benson, back in the day from Concordia, I guess he's got a podcast now, and I watched it, and he said, "You got to watch this, Greg. We interviewed this doctor," and I went back to get the doctor's name. The podcast has already been scrubbed from YouTube. This guy is a board-certified physician in Orange County. He's been dealing with this pandemic from the very get-go, and he just has a different opinion than the narrative that's coming down from certain circles. And when he spoke out about that, and he's been talking about his cases and talking about the successes and all the different kinds of things he's dealing with, he was scrubbed from the internet. And I'm like, why is a board-certified doctor who's in the middle of this pandemic, who's demonstrating what's happening with what he's doing? And it was the hydroxychloroquine issue and all these kind of things. But, and he's also, there's no scientific evidence, he said, for not going back to school. There's just none. And so those voices, it's not that they're disagreed with, it's they're being scrubbed from the internet. That should be a problem for those of you who are at all worried about just general things. You know, if there's a big issue in the culture, what you need is more voices at the table. You need to hear more information, not less, so that you can make an informed decision. We have people who are deciding what those issues should be and how we should think of those things. I brought you the discussion last week about the New York Times op-ed board and what happened to the leader of the op-ed portion of the paper. One has been fired and the other one was forced out. Why? Because they wouldn't stick to a narrative. And her point was, no, we should present facts and let people discover the narrative on their own terms. No, you need to present the facts that fit a narrative. That should be problematic. Now, again, right now on Capitol Hill, there is a thing that's dealing with Google and Facebook. For those of you who don't know this, you should be aware of this. Google and Facebook have been given certain blessings and protections, governmental protections. Why? Because they were operating like a utility. So they said, hey, we're like the phone company, so, you know, give us special protections against liability and things like that. And they were supposed to just be a free and open communication vehicle that we would then use. So just like the phone, you pick up the phone, there's not somebody telling you what you can say on the phone, and then there's not somebody telling you who you can call on the phone. That's what utility is, just to provide that service for you. Google and Facebook are actually starting to determine what the message is that you get and who can actually message on their utility. And I'm hoping and praying that the Congress takes those special protections away from them, so then there can be more competition, so that they're not the only vehicle that can bring information to the marketplace. There is a guy, Dr. Robert Epstein, if you want to study this, again, but it just shows the disinformation that's out there. Epstein has been doing a study on Google and Facebook about how they can manipulate data with their algorithms. And so, again, they can actually determine what information you get. So they can determine if you get nothing but pages of negative information on this person or pages of positive information on this person. And they said in his study, he thinks that they can sway anywhere from 2 to 3 to 10% of a vote in any given election. That is huge. And folks, what that means is when you look up something, if you look up, let's say, President Trump right now, you will not find a positive story on him on Google for several pages, if at all. And again, I'm not talking about who you voted for, but I mean, if you want to talk about pro-life president, he's one of the most pro-life presidents we've ever had. Pro-jobs, pro-middle class, pro-small businesses of all ethnicities, you know, all this kind of stuff. There's all kinds of data out there, but you will not see any of those kinds of stories. So my question is, wait a minute, if those are important issues to me, why shouldn't I see the stories? And that's all I'm telling you right now. We should be able to find that information, and they shouldn't be able to determine which of the information we get to make our decisions. But that's what's going on right now. Well, back to the pro-life stories, we actually have a story like that too. The Covington Catholic student, Nick Sandeman, when you think about what happened to him and what the media was able to do to him and the stories that propagated about him, he came with it was the Covington Catholic School that came for the pro-life march a few years ago. And he was confronted by some activists, and one of them was a Native American activist. But they were doing exactly what these activists do now. They were trying to incite a situation, and then they were going to try to put an edited version of it on the web to create all kinds of nonsense. Well, this kid just stood there. He just stood there and smiled. He didn't take the bait. And yet, because of the way his facial features came off, the whole news was that he was this arrogant kid that came up and took on this guy, got in his face, all this stuff. They destroyed his character. Now, when the news can destroy a high school kid who is actually doing nothing wrong, we let high school kids do all kinds of nefarious things, but this is a kid who's doing nothing wrong, and they destroyed his character. And to such a degree where he actually won a defamation lawsuit against CNN. I think it was $250,000, and then he's got another civil suit. Good for him, because I'm getting tired of the job of the news media is to let us know what's going on, and we are to present, or to kind of discover what it really truly means. And that's not how things are being presented. We're seeing things on television now, we're going, I know exactly what's happening there, and we're being told exactly the opposite of what we see. That is a problem. I started seeing this already with the Walk for Life when I participated in the Walk for Life. Yvette and I have been part of the pro-life movement for a long time. We used to, on the day of life, we would do our things with our church members and things like that. We would try to get our voice out in the community. We try to make sure people were aware of what was going on in the clinics and those kind of things. We also participated in pro-life clinics in New York City where we actually helped save children, actually bringing children to term, supporting the women who brought their kids to term, who would have otherwise aborted their children. We were part of that movement for a long time. When I saw the positiveness of the March for Life, I mean, it's a positive event. It comes in January. If you want to come, if you have never been, come. It's one of the best protests in our country because it's so positive, so affirming, so joyful, and it really is changing the narrative on a lot of what's going on out there today. So again, I look at this and I say, why wasn't it reported as this huge thing? Because that's what it was. It's again because there's a narrative in the media, and that is what's troubling to me on what's out there. So as we look at the pro-life movement, let's talk about the backdrop, because we are in D.C., that's one of our main reasons. Religious liberty and the sanctity of life are our two biggies. Why? Because if the sanctity of life gives way, none of this other stuff matters. I mean, if certain people can start looking at another person's life and say that life doesn't matter, then I don't know what you're fighting for with the other political issues. Now, someone said back in the day they used to try to shame us into saying you're a single issue voter. Well, if you mean single because it's superfluous and I'm just, it's just my single political focus, I guess, maybe shame on me. But the pro-life movement, life is a fundamental thing in virtually every issue. So it's a fundamental issue, and for that I don't make any apology whatsoever. So if you mean a singular voter as a fundamental issue, yeah, you can count me in. And I think every Christian should be able to boldly say, of course I am. Why wouldn't you be? Because of the sanctity of life, there's outrage over George Floyd. Because of the sanctity of life, there's outrage over the knee also of that 20-year-old child abuser on the neck of a toddler in Ohio. And the people who are protesting for what happened to George Floyd, they should be protesting what that guy did to that, I don't think it was a 2-year-old little white toddler. He had his knee on his neck and someone else had the toddler's arms behind his back and he was crying, and he was a 20-year-old. We should be outraged by that because of the sanctity of life. the outrage of the killing of there's an African-American man in Milwaukee, and he was talking about why the new government policies that are going on have been really great for the black community, for his business, for his neighborhood, and he was shot in cold blood. That's ridiculous. Sanctity of life demands that cannot be who we are. And the sanctity of life, it says that these race issues have been things we've been contending for decades. The Dred Scott issue was a sanctity of life issue. And the Democrats of that day said, no, they're less than human life. And they had stare decisis to back them up. They had other rulings that supposedly gave them permission to come up with that ruling. Wrong. It was bad ruling then. It was unconstitutional ruling by a Supreme Court, and it was overturned, thank God. So again, as we think about this, even systemic racism, which has been an issue for over the last 150 years, especially since post-Civil War, it's been divided, not just white-black, it's been divided politically. Because there were some folks, the Democrats were always for systemic racism. And please don't give me this thing that Republicans have become the old Democrats. Our platform has never changed. The thing that irritates me about Republicans is they don't act on their platform. They say they're going to do the right things. They don't always act on them. So, we've got to work on that aspect. Politicians are hard to get to do what they say. But when your platform is actually systemically racist, you got to own that. You have to own that. In fact, I had one guy who said the history, people don't know their history. It was Richard Nixon who brought all the bigots from the South into the Republican Party. Bull. There's all kinds of reasons why the South started turning Republican. I don't want to get into that. But I do have absolute data why LBJ used the war on poverty. He said, and his quote was, and he used the N-word, he said, we're going to have them voting for us for the next 200 years. They turned their tactics away from using Bull Connor and the law against African Americans to actually making them dependent on government, which would destroy their community from within. And that was an initiative, and it's very clear why that initiative was set upon us, and we have it in LBJ's own words. Okay, I'm just saying that's a pro-life issue. That's what is the value of human life issue. And so we're a pro-life church, we're a pro-life people, and we contend with all these issues because we think that life is precious and life is sanctified. So just a couple of things right off the bat. We are advocates for life because virtually everything that we talk about flows from the inherent dignity of humanity because they're created in the image of God. And God is the one who gives life to all people. Paul talks about that in Acts chapter 17. But also in 1 Timothy 6, it talks about how God is the one who gives life to all things. And then, of course, Genesis, he's the one who breathes into Adam, and Adam becomes a living being. So I love Francis Schaeffer's quote on this. Let me read it. It said, if man is not made in the image of God, then nothing stands in the way of inhumanity. There is no good reason why man should be perceived, mankind he means here, should be perceived as special. And then he goes on to argue, once human life is cheapened, then we can create this notion of the life that's not worth living. That is the mantra of the fascists. That is the mantra of the supremacists. That is the mantra of the secularists. That's the mantra of the Darwinists. There's certain life that is worth living and certain life that is not. I just saw an article by my colleague Tim Gegline called, there's a lot of articles on this, but he wrote on it specifically called Canceling Margaret Sanger. I've been telling you about Margaret Sanger for the last 3-4 weeks, and because she's a secularist. And people keep talking about supremacy and white supremacy. And I said that white supremacy did have a white face 120 years ago, especially at the turn of last century. But it was a white secular face. And now it has a diverse face, but it's still secular and it's still supremacist. And she was one of those. And she talked about the science of breeding. And it was taking all of these Darwinian notions and applying it to sociology. And she was using Planned Parenthood. She's the founder of Planned Parenthood. Well, evidently, Planned Parenthood now realizes it's pretty hard to keep PRing her. Hillary Clinton actually was proud to receive the Margaret Sanger Award back in the day. Margaret Sanger. a eugenics person, Margaret Sanger, a racist, Margaret Sanger who wanted black people to be rooted out through abortion. Well, Planned Parenthood is starting to realize they can't really hold on to her. My point is they're still holding on to the viewpoints that she had. They're just kind of, they're making it a little bit more palatable. That's why I always challenge people, you know, back in her day, she would have brought people in and had things done to them. Now she's amazed that people are paying her money to do her bidding. And I don't know what the data is on this, but I'm pretty sure it's kind of like liquor stores and abortion clinics. You know where they're highly concentrated. So again, the Sanctity of Life says this is disgusting. Why should we be that kind of people? And again, that's why this is not a singular issue in the same sense as just being a single issue voter type of thing. So again, fighting against the notion of life, that notion that life is not worth living. We fight against that because we think all people have inherent dignity and all people have potential and purpose in life. That's what's at risk, and our culture today is at war with that defense. So they're saying there are some lives that are not worth living. Children in the womb are one of them. There's also legislation that says older folks who aren't very productive in society are the next. And then they'll progressively go from there. That should scare you because that's already happening legislatively. And we're pushing back against those kinds of things. Now, there are some articles out there that I think we could probably focus on today that are very helpful to us. The first one is Josh Hawley. I love what this guy's doing. He's the new senator in Missouri, and he's taking the Hill by storm. I don't know if everybody appreciates that, but at least he's saying what a lot of us have been saying. We should be talking very clearly about what we say is important to us politically, rather than all these euphemisms that are out there. Hawley says when it comes to putting somebody on the Supreme Court, he is going to finally say, tell me yes or no whether Roe v. Wade was good law or bad law. See, Roe v. Wade is the Dred Scott issue of our day. It was not for the court to decide. There are states right now that are radically pro-abortion. You want to live there, that's your business. New York actually cheered an abortion law that said if a baby is born even at the time of viability in the 9th month, if that baby was to be aborted, we will let it die on the table. Now, again, Republicans in the federal, in the Capitol have been trying to bring to a vote the Born Alive bill, which says if a baby is born alive, you cannot abort it. And they are being thwarted by the Democratic Party. Again, it's mind-boggling to me that there are people standing up and saying, I'm for letting that kid die. Wow, if they're willing to let that child die, then what else are they willing to do? Mother Teresa said that the society that allows abortion and that champions abortion, that's finally, to allow that, that's when a mother can kill her child in the womb, when the mother's natural instinct is to protect their child at all costs. That's the maternal instinct. Well, to overcome that maternal instinct at that level means that almost everything can be overturned, and violence and poverty and all the kinds of things that ensue from that degradation of life. She said, you've got to stand up for life for the sake of all. And so again, when we look at Hawley is saying, hey, it's bad law, and he's not saying that he's not taking a side per se on the abortion debate. Now I know what his perspective is on that, but he's saying it's up to the legislatures. It's up to the people to decide these issues, not for the Supreme Court to decide these issues. And so again, I love that he's saying that's what it's about. And in this election, the court is going to be a huge issue again, because we believe the court's job is to say what is constitutional and not constitutional. It is not to create law. So their job is to say, well, that violates the 14th Amendment. You can't do that. Not to create another law within the 14th Amendment, like the right of privacy, which is not in the 14th Amendment. And then the right of privacy to kill your child. And by the way, you can't do it by yourself, although that's what the abortifacients movement is, that people are actually selling women drugs that can kill their child in the home. In the home. But they're not disposing of the child, whether the child's flushed down the toilet or whether the child is put in a garbage bag. None of that is dealt with at all. But here's the pill that can end and you can do it now in the privacy of your own home. This is macabre. This is the kind of stuff that should turn our stomachs to think that we're doing this to our own people. Okay, so his point is we're going to say that was never to be decided by the Supreme Court. It should go back to the legislature or the legislatures of the states. I think that's great, and he's standing up for that. Let the moral people of the country decide. Now, if pro-life gives way, and here's a book for you to read by David Fiorazo, and it's called The Cost of Our Silence. You know, I agree with people who say that the church has to be careful not to become politicized, and I agree with that. And that's why we stand for these four main issues, which I can defend for the sake of all people, even those who don't agree with us. Religious liberty, sanctity of life, institution of marriage as a religious liberty issue. Okay? You don't have to agree with us, but you cannot forcibly make us teach what is against our conscience. And then educational freedom. More and more we're starting to realize the educational system has to be decentralized, or basically we're gonna be living with the nonsense of one narrative, no matter what the facts are. So again, as we look at this, The Cost of Our Silence, an excellent book, and it talks about the cost of our moral silence in a lot of major issues today. And we can see the progression of violence, we can see the progression of poverty, illiteracy. We can see all those things because we've given up contending for these moral issues in the public square. If this stuff gives way, then, the Kermit Gosnells of the world, and you probably don't even know who that is. That abortion doctor that had baby parts all over his place, that was abusing poor women, that was actually charging more to kill babies that were further along. I mean, this guy was an evil doctor par excellence in that sense. I mean, it was just unbelievable, and he was operating for years, unchecked. And the politicians always said, well, we didn't want to do anything with Gosnell because that would make it harder for a woman to get an abortion. Well, there's got to be some protections for the sake of the women and for the children when guys like that are out there. Selling baby parts. There's more and more evidence. This article just came, Planned Parenthood testimony on selling baby parts unsealed. That's exactly what they're doing. They're making money off dead children. None of this should be happening. I've got a mom and pop paper about this where it talks. My daughter and I went to the museum in Washington D.C. and it showed the Holocaust, and it made you look at what was actually happening in those camps. When you see baby parts for sale, you need to see that because it will disgust. It will turn your stomach. We can't be a people who monetize the killing of children. We can't make an industry out of it. And that is what is happening all around the country. Euphemisms will become the public language. We won't be dealing with straight talk. Pro-choice never deals with pro-choice of what? What are you talking about? Pro-choice to do what? Pro-life is pro-science. The fetus is a child in the womb. It is domicile in the woman's body. It is not a part of. It is not like a leg or an arm. It is actually a living being, self-contained, who is living within the womb of a mother. What a beautiful thing, until people say, well, kill it. And then if you are going to, we just say deal with the reality of one's choice. And there's more and more people who are saying, man, if you've had an abortion, we're not saying that there is no forgiveness for those things, but deal with the reality of those kinds of things. Because, again, as a culture, we cannot harden ourselves to the miracle of life and to the sanctity of life. Because once we harden ourselves to those things, all kinds of things can break forth. Okay? the other thing, if you talk about what's on the horizon, then if we lose this pro-life battle, the next wave, if a child in the womb is a life not worth living, then we start monetizing lives and valuing lives as to what they can bring to society. And we've already seen that a little bit in the pandemic because, again, what happened in New York, people have, of course, swept it under the rug. But the fact is, the most vulnerable population was susceptible to the pandemic in ways that other states protected them. People were forced to deal with sick patients, and they were put back in nursing homes, and nursing homes were the most vulnerable people in the culture. And so you can already begin to see that there's not as much of an outcry. And you're like, well, there should be a huge outcry to that. But there's this notion that at the end of life or at the beginning of life, you're not really as valuable. And the Christian notion is we're going to be judged by how we cherish the most vulnerable in our lives. That's why even some of the issues, what we've been talking about in race and race issues, of course they're important to us because all life is precious to God. And so again, the rise of euthanasia, more and more of this is happening in states. There was an article I read called Maine's Adoption of Physician-Assisted Suicide Accelerates an Ominous Trend. Now this was a while back. It was actually last year, but there are more and more states that are turning the medical profession on its ear. Because the medical profession, its oath is to do no harm. Well, the minute your doctor is starting to persuade you to kill yourself, the pressure of family, doctor, and then of course the pain and suffering you may be going through if you have an illness, you can see how it's an easy way to dispense with people with very little pushback in society. History repeats itself when you go down the wrong road. One of the first things that Hitler did is he offered universal health care to everybody, and he started to actually take care of the older folks. He said he was actually giving them free health care, but in reality he was starting to deal with the older people and the deformed folks in his society. He was making sure that they were part of the first solution, the first wave of the Holocaust before he got finally to the Jewish folks. So again, that's what we're battling against, all of that. When we talk about pro-life is a way of thinking about all these issues, and it's one thing we have to contend for. And we should be able to explain to people who even disagree with us, we think their life is precious. We think their life has inherent value, and that's why we even feel like we should take up the challenge to debate them on these issues, because their life really does matter that much. So what to do? Pray for our country. There is a pro-life move in our country, but it is still underreported. It is mocked by those who control the media message, the entertainment message, the political, even the education aspect of our culture. And we've got to pray for that. And I know one of you mentioned to me, and I forgot to bring the email with me, but the Global Day of Repentance and Prayer. I'll look into that more. I think that you're talking about the edict that President Trump was dealing with, that we need to actually turn to God. Look, every Sunday is the day when we offer up prayers for our country. So for now, I'll investigate the Global Day of Prayer more, but for now, bring your petitions for your country every night before you go to bed, and every Sunday together as a church, because this pro-life message is one we cannot lose in any way, shape, or form. Vote life across the board. I'm sorry, I know this sounds... if people don't stand for life, they'll fall for anything else. And there are 20 million Democrats. There are pro-life Democrats, and they're trying to get it back on the pro-life platform. I could deal with some of these issues about soft socialism and capitalism, but the pro-life message is the message that should be on both platforms. The reason why it's not on the Democratic platform, if you're a Democrat in my audience, that's something you got to come to grips with, because when you look at all these other issues, they claim to be for life. And yet I would challenge you to even start to see some of those euphemistic ways they talk about things as to whether they're really helping the people they say they do. A big step forward that would prove me wrong here, and I'd be happy to be proven wrong, is that they would put the pro-life initiatives back on their platform. My biggest, again, problem with the Republicans is how they say they're for it, and then when it comes to actually voting for it, a lot of them get skittish on this stuff. And shame on them, and we'll keep the pressure on there as well. But above all things, we should be pro-life people, especially in our neighborhoods and in our communities, and it should be something that we unashamedly demand of those who serve us. And then present the pro-life message as purposeful, as joyful. That's the way it is. It's a purposeful, joyful way of living life. It honors God. It honors family. It honors community. It honors those with whom we disagree. It undergirds the fundamental inherent dignity of all people. And think about this. If you're a pro-life person, you do temper government's role in your life. And you want government abuse to be legislated or justice to be served. So you want a limited view of government in your life and a limited view even of good policing in your life. Why? So that you can live a life that is sanctified, that is pro-life for the sake of your family and for the sake of your children and your neighborhood. And so again, each person has that intrinsic pro-life value unless they forfeit that, because of their outward actions to the contrary. So killing, stealing, the breaking of these vows to others, those kinds of things, that begins to rescind what is inherently yours. But the government never grants you those rights. It's only your actions that can finally mitigate that inherent dignity. And again, pro-life is pro-science. But again, it shows what people are doing with scientific data today. Remember, science can only tell you that something is true. It can't tell you the moral issue of whether you should do that or not. So it can tell you you're going, a speedometer can tell you that you're going 25 miles an hour or 95 miles an hour. It can't tell you whether that's how fast you should be going. There's a moral discussion that's bigger than just the data of the science that you have. And that's what's going on in the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Do what you can with the politics of this issue. Vote for judges who will eliminate the Dred Scott issue of our time, and that's what Roe v. Wade is. It's the Dred Scott issue. But get ready to deal with this then on a much more personal state level, community level, where you need to be able to defend why pro-life is the right way of thinking for all of us, even for those with whom we disagree. You're going to be dealing with people who feel that they have the right to kill a child at any time in the child's development, and it's their right to do. You're going to have to learn how to deal with that issue. And some people are more rabidly that way than others, but the point is you have to be able to talk about why there's a better way to live. Okay, and that's the key. And then speak the truth in love with gentleness, humility, and with courage. The one thing I didn't talk about today, if pro-life gives way, and it's already starting to happen, if pro-life gives way as it is giving way in some other ways, the abortion debate is kind of falling to the wayside a little bit. Why? Because people are doing the abortions now more privately in their homes, and people aren't getting married and having children very much anymore. And so marriage is dissolving in our culture, and that is also a result of this lack of a pro-life, pro-child view of humanity. People used to yearn to get married, to yearn to have children, and saw children as a gift of their relationship. A lot of people describe children now as they had sex, now they have this punishment called having a child. Those are two radically different views of life. And so again, contending for those issues I think is important. So again, thanks again for the thoughts and the prayers on our ministry. We've got a lot to talk about next week. Maybe this censorship stuff, we'll talk more about that again. The religious liberty stuff is going to be with us all the way to the election. If you are now being forced back in your homes, as some places are now doing again, be courageous, be fearless, live your life in a way that honors God, that tries to serve your neighbor, but that is not dictated to by those in authority, because those in authority really are working for us in the American experiment, and we need to hold them accountable to righteous leadership as well. So speak the truth in love with humility and grace. Be wise as serpents and harmless as dove. Until next time, may God richly bless you. I'm Gregory Seltz. I'll see you next Wednesday Same time, same place. Take care.